Usually when we talk about presenting credentials, there is this expectation of self-promotion, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it is a very natural human instinct.
I mean, think of a modern courtroom. An expert witness takes the stand, and before they say a single word about the case, the lawyer basically walks them through their resume.
They want to know where you studied, what degrees you hold, all those things.
Yeah, how many books you have published, that sort of thing. The whole goal is to establish authority through personal achievement.
Right, you build yourself up so the jury will actually listen to your testimony. We look for the accolades because we want the reassurance that the person speaking has the intellectual capital to back up their claims.
Exactly. Wait, no, not exactly, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
We want to know they are qualified.
Yeah, and in the ancient world, especially in Rome, this was even more pronounced. The Romans lived by a really strict social hierarchy.
Right.
Honor, status, and public recognition they were the currency of the day.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted a hearing, you had to project dominance and pedigree.
But then you open up a letter written 2,000 years ago, addressed to a group of Christians living right in the capital of that Roman Empire, and that entire expectation just, gets flipped on its head.
It really does.
We're looking at a credential presentation that is completely upside down by our standards. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. We have a custom-tailored deep dive ready for you today.
And we are looking closely at David S. Dockery's Holman Concise Bible Commentary.
Yeah, specifically focusing on Romans chapter 1, alongside a huge overview of Pauline doctrines. So if you are listening to this, you are stepping into a massive analysis of the mechanics of salvation.
We are going to analyze the vast scope of Paul's letters and the stark contrast between the human condition and divine intervention.
Right. We're unpacking how a person goes from being completely condemned to having a right standing before God.
And that entire theological weight begins by looking at the man bringing the message. Yeah, Paul. He introduces his identity right out of the gate in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. He calls himself a servant of God, an apostle, and someone who is set apart for the gospel of God.
So think back to that courtroom analogy.
Mm-hmm.
If Paul is on the stand, establishing his right to speak to the Romans, he actually has a stellar resume he could use, right?
Oh, an incredible one.
He was educated under the famous Rabbi Gamaliel. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees.
He had the ancient equivalent of an Ivy League theological doctorate.
Right. But he leaves all of that off the table. He starts by calling himself a servant.
And the tension in that introduction is, it's fascinating when you look at the original language.
How so?
Well, when we hear the word servant, we might think of a butler or an employee or someone who punches a clock and goes home at 5.
Right, like a hired hand.
Yeah, but the Greek word used there is doulos. It carries the weight of a bondservant, someone who belongs entirely to their master.
Oh, wow.
A doulos in the first century had no independent agenda, no property rights, and really no personal autonomy. His entire life, his schedule, his goals, they are all dictated by the one who owns him.
So by adopting that title, Paul is claiming a position of absolute lowliness.
Yeah, but in the very next breath, he claims to be an apostle.
Which is a massive swing. He goes from the lowest possible social rung to the highest tier of religious authority.
Yes, and that juxtaposition is very deliberate. An apostle is a sent one, an authorized representative.
Right.
In the ancient Near East, an imperial envoy or an apostle carried the full authority of the sovereign who sent them. If you rejected the envoy, you were rejecting the king.
So Paul is holding these two realities together. He is a lowly doulos, entirely submitted with no rights of his own, yet he carries the highest possible authority because he speaks on behalf of God.
Exactly, or rather, that is completely right. He is establishing his authority not through personal ambition, but by being drafted into a specific role. He says he is set apart. Set apart. That phrase, it implies he was taken out of general circulation and repurposed for a specific task.
Yeah, he did not volunteer for this out of a desire for career advancement. He was apprehended for it.
Right. You read the account in Acts, and Christ literally knocks him off his horse on the road to Damascus. He was drafted.
Totally drafted.
So how does this dual identity, this tension between complete submission and total authority, frame the way he writes to the Christians at Rome?
Well, it frames his entire approach to them. Because he is an apostle, he has the right to teach them the heaviest, most dense theology they will ever hear.
Yeah, he really doesn't pull any punches regarding human sin or divine judgment later on.
No, not at all. But because he is a bondservant, he approaches them with a pastoral heart rather than a dictatorial one. The text notes his eagerness to proclaim the gospel there, and it highlights his constant prayers for them.
Right, he's not writing a sterile theological treatise from an ivory tower somewhere. No, he is writing as a man who desperately cares for their souls, even though he had not actually visited their church when he wrote this letter. The affection is palpable right alongside the intellectual rigor.
Yeah, and to really grasp the magnitude of Romans, you can't just look at it in a vacuum. You have to look at the full scope of his letters.
Definitely.
Dockery's commentary provides this massive doctrinal table that maps out the emphases across Paul's writings. Each letter acts like a distinct tool designed for a specific historical and theological problem.
Paul did not just sit around writing abstract philosophy. He wrote to real people dealing with real crises.
That historical grounding is so essential. These were letters carried by hand across the Mediterranean to put out fires, to correct bad theology, and to comfort terrified believers.
Yeah, so let's break this toolbox down, starting with what we can call the salvation texts. This includes Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians.
Okay, let's look at Romans itself first. The commentary states the objective of Romans is to express the nature of the gospel, its relation to the Old Testament and Jewish law, and its efficacy to alter human lives.
And the major doctrine here is salvation.
The historical ripple effect of this single letter is just staggering. The text points out that in 1515, Martin Luther, while preparing lectures on Romans, felt himself to be reborn.
You really have to understand Luther's psychological state before that moment to appreciate what Romans did to him.
Right, he was a monk, right?
Yeah, an Augustinian monk in Erfurt, and he was agonizing over his inability to achieve a righteous standing before God. He would spend hours in confession.
Hours, like daily.
Oh, yeah. He was trying to use the law, his own moral effort, to bridge the gap between his sin and God's absolute holiness. It was crushing him mentally and physically.
Man.
He actually grew to resent the concept of God's righteousness because he viewed it strictly as a condemning standard he could never meet.
But then he encounters Romans.
Right. He realizes that the righteousness of God in the gospel is not a standard that condemns him, but a gift that justifies him. The weight of the world basically fell off his shoulders.
Wow. And we see a strikingly similar phenomenon with Galatians. The commentary notes that the objective of Galatians was to stress freedom in Christ against Jewish legalism while carefully avoiding moral license.
Again, the major doctrine is salvation.
And the historical note here involves John Wesley. Hearing a sermon on the book of Galatians brought peace to his heart. Wesley's realization was, I felt I did trust Christ alone for salvation.
Notice the common denominator between Luther and Wesley there.
Yeah.
Both men were incredibly religious. Both were trying their absolute hardest to be good, upstanding, moral individuals. But their religion was producing exhaustion and despair.
Right. They were burned out.
Yeah.
Why do Romans and Galatians, out of all the historical texts available, trigger such massive paradigm shifts in followers like them?
It is because these texts dismantle the human instinct to earn favor. Wesley realized he'd been relying on his own religious performance. When he finally grasped the core doctrine of salvation as taught in Galatians, that it centers on trusting Christ alone without the addition of legalism, circumcision, or personal merit, it created an intellectual and spiritual awakening.
It makes me think of someone trying to pay off a billion-dollar debt with pocket change.
That is a great image.
Yeah, they are scraping pennies together, exhausted, terrified of the debt collector. Then suddenly they read a legal document proving the debt was already canceled by someone else.
The relief must have been physical.
Seriously. The entire system of legalism says do, but Galatians basically says done.
That captures the transition perfectly. Then we look at Ephesians, the third in this group of salvation texts. The objective here is to explain God's eternal purpose and grace and the goals God has for the church.
And Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the famous poet and philosopher, called Ephesians one of the divinest of compositions.
Yeah, if Romans is the courtroom laying out the legal mechanics of salvation, and Galatians is the battlefield defending that salvation from legalism, then Ephesians feels like standing on a mountain peak looking at the vast eternal scope of what God is doing.
Ephesians pulls the camera way back to show the cosmic plan.
It really does. Paul starts before the foundation of the world, discussing predestination and adoption, and then moves into how that eternal decree plays out in time through the unification of Jews and Gentiles into one new man.
It connects the individual believer's salvation to the grand design of the universe.
Exactly. I mean, yes, absolutely. Now, moving from the cosmic to the incredibly local, we shift to the second section of the table, focusing on the church in practice.
Right, so we are looking at 1st and 2nd Corinthians alongside Philippians. 1 Corinthians is fascinating because it is so messy.
Oh, incredibly messy.
The commentary lists its objective: to respond to questions about marriage, idol food, and public worship, to discourage factions, and to instruct on resurrection. The major doctrines are the church and the resurrection.
You know, Corinth was a chaotic, cosmopolitan port city. It was famous for its wealth, its transient sailor population, and its rampant immorality.
And the church there reflected that chaos.
Completely. They were divided into factions, following different celebrity teachers. They were suing each other in secular courts. They were struggling with massive ethical failures.
I just picture 1 Corinthians as a troubleshooting manual for a highly dysfunctional organization. Paul is just going through a checklist of disasters.
Pretty much. But he does not just give them behavioral modification tips. He anchors his solutions in theology.
Right in the middle of this troubleshooting manual, we get chapter 13, the famous hymn on love, which the text notes is among the most familiar and loved chapters in Paul's writings.
Yeah.
And he finishes with chapter 15, a massive defense of the physical resurrection. But wait, how does teaching about a future physical resurrection solve their present-day behavioral problems?
Because the Corinthians had absorbed a lot of Greek philosophy, which taught that the physical body was a prison and only the spirit mattered.
Oh, I see.
Right. So if you believe your body does not matter eternally, you will either punish it through extreme asceticism or indulge it through wild immorality, which is what they were doing.
So Paul corrects their behavior by correcting their theology.
Yes. He insists the body matters so much that God is going to resurrect it. You cannot sleep with a temple prostitute if that physical body is destined for eternal glory. He anchors their practical chaos in theological reality.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Contrast that troubleshooting manual with 2 Corinthians, though. The objective of the second letter is to prepare readers for Paul's third visit and to defend Paul and the gospel he taught against false teachers.
The major doctrines shift to the church, Jesus Christ, and salvation.
And the commentary quotes C.K. Barrett, who calls 2 Corinthians the fullest and most passionate account of what Paul meant by apostleship.
Yeah, if 1 Corinthians is Paul fixing a broken machine, 2 Corinthians is Paul defending his own heart. False teachers, whom Paul sarcastically calls super apostles, had infiltrated the church. They were attacking Paul's character, his speaking ability, and his authority.
Basically a smear campaign.
Totally. They claimed that because Paul suffered so much, he must not have God's blessing. The ancient world viewed suffering as a sign of divine disfavor.
So Paul is forced to defend himself, but he does it in the most counterintuitive way possible. He boasts in his weaknesses.
Right.
He outlines his shipwrecks, his beatings, his stonings, and his daily anxiety for the churches. He argues that his physical weakness is the exact venue where Christ's strength is made visible.
It is raw, vulnerable, and intensely personal. He completely subverts their definition of success.
Then we have Philippians in this practical block. The objective here is to commend Epaphroditus, to affirm generosity, and to encourage unity, humility, and faithfulness even to death.
The major doctrines are Christian unity and joy in salvation.
There's a quote from Bengal in 1850 summarizing Philippians. The sum of the epistles is, "I rejoice, rejoice ye."
What makes that joy so striking is the context. Paul is writing Philippians from a Roman prison cell.
Yeah, he is chained to a Praetorian guard. He is facing potential execution. Epaphroditus, the man the Philippian church sent to care for Paul, got deathly ill along the journey.
The situation is objectively terrible.
Yet the entire letter just radiates joy. It proves that the salvation he outlined in Romans and Galatians is not just theoretical. It provides a psychological anchor that circumstantial suffering cannot touch.
He can rejoice because his joy is tethered to the advancement of the gospel, not his personal comfort. Even his imprisonment, he argues, has served to advance the message among the imperial guard.
Which provides a really natural transition to our third subsection, supremacy and orthodoxy, specifically looking at the letter to the Colossians.
The text notes the specific historical conflict here. Paul wrote Colossians to oppose false teachings related to a matter and spirit dualism and to stress the complete adequacy of Christ.
What was that dualism about?
This dualism was an early form of Gnosticism. It was a philosophy that viewed all physical matter as inherently evil and all spirit as inherently good.
Okay, so that created a massive problem for the Christian understanding of Jesus, right?
Huge problem. If matter is evil, how could a holy God take on a physical human body? The false teachers in Colossae were trying to insert angelic mediators between God and humanity, arguing that Jesus was just one of many emanations.
Oh, I see. So Paul writes to establish Christ's total adequacy and absolute supremacy.
Yes.
The commentary gives us some serious historical facts regarding this letter, specifically Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, which is part of an early Christian hymn on the supremacy of Christ.
Right.
The text states that Arius of Alexandria in the year 318 AD used this specific verse to undermine Christ's deity.
This is one of the most critical moments in church history. Arius was a presbyter who looked at the phrase firstborn of all creation in Colossians 1:15. He argued that the word firstborn meant Jesus was a created being. He famously taught that there was a time when the Son was not. He argued that Jesus was the highest creation, the first thing God ever made, but still a creature.
That one interpretation of a single Greek word sparked a theological firestorm that threatened to tear the Roman Empire apart.
It really did.
The commentary notes the result. Arianism was pronounced heretical at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD and the Council of Constantinople in 381 AD. How does a single verse from a localized letter become the central battleground for defining Orthodox Christianity?
Because the entire Christian faith hinges on the identity of Jesus. Athanasius, the great defender of orthodoxy against Arius, saw the fatal flaw in Arianism.
Which was?
If Arius was right and Jesus is a created being, then a creature died on the cross, not God incarnate. A finite creature cannot bear the infinite wrath of God on behalf of humanity.
Only God can satisfy the justice of God.
Spot on. The early church fathers recognized that if you lose the eternal deity of Christ, you lose the mechanics of salvation entirely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They had to clarify from the rest of Scripture that firstborn, or prototokos in Greek, refers to rank, inheritance, and supremacy over creation. It does not mean being the first created thing.
Oh, like David is called the firstborn of the kings of the earth in the Psalms, even though he was the youngest in his family.
Yes, great example. Paul's letter, designed to assert Christ's supremacy against a local cult, became the very text used to defend his eternal deity against a global heresy.
The tools in Paul's toolbox are incredibly sharp.
They are.
Now we turn to the letters concerning the last things. This covers 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The dual objective of these letters is clearly laid out in our source material. First, to encourage new converts who are facing intense persecution. Second, to instruct them and correct misunderstandings about the second coming of Christ.
You know, the Thessalonian church was birthed in a riot. You can read about it in Acts. Paul was chased out of town after only a few weeks.
So he leaves behind this infant congregation in a highly hostile environment.
Yeah, and the focus on the second coming in his follow-up letters is pervasive. The text highlights that every single chapter of 1 Thessalonians ends with a reference to the Lord's return.
And 2 Thessalonians is incredibly brief at only 3 chapters. But the source notes it is one of Paul's most extensively studied letters, specifically because of chapter 2, verses 3 through 10, which deals with the man of lawlessness and the specific events preceding the return.
Right.
But wait, if you have a group of brand new believers who are being physically persecuted, losing their livelihoods, and facing the threat of death, does an intense, constant focus on the end times distract them from daily living? Is telling a starving, persecuted church to look at the clouds just a form of religious escapism?
Yeah.
How does eschatology help them survive the week?
That is a very common critique. People say, you are so heavenly minded, you are of no earthly good.
Right.
But Paul uses the future to anchor the present. He does not teach eschatology to satisfy chronological curiosity. He teaches it to provide stamina. Yes. For a persecuted church, knowing that divine justice is a certainty, knowing that Christ will physically return to set the world to rights, offers them the exact grounding they need to hold the line today.
Wow.
It is not an escape hatch. If the story ends with their persecution, despair is the only logical response. If the story ends with the return of the king who judges the living and the dead, endurance makes sense. The future hope dictates the present action.
That reframes the whole concept of studying the end times. It is about present-day resilience. We see that transition into practical resilience as we look at the final group of letters: leadership, ethics, and liberty.
We are looking at the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and the short letter to Philemon.
These are the letters where Paul is passing the baton. He knows his life is coming to an end. The focus shifts toward church structure, leadership qualifications, and maintaining sound teaching in the next generation.
A movement cannot survive on the charisma of its founder forever. It needs structure.
Let's analyze 1 Timothy. The objective is to encourage Timothy as a minister, refute false doctrine, and instruct about church organization and leadership.
And the commentary provides a fascinating historical note. Thomas Aquinas, before his death in 1274, described 1 Timothy as a pastoral textbook.
It has been formally known as a pastoral epistle since the early 18th century, right?
Yeah. Aquinas recognized the sheer practical utility of the letter. It outlines the moral and domestic qualifications for elders and deacons.
It provides the architectural blueprints for how a local congregation should function long after the original apostles are gone.
Right. It deals with how to care for widows, how to handle church discipline, and how to govern worship.
Then we have 2 Timothy. The focus here is education and encouragement in the face of persecution and false doctrine. The historical figure attached here in the source is Augustine, who died in 430 AD.
He used 2 Timothy in his book on Christian doctrine to support the necessity of Christian teachers.
2 Timothy is Paul's final letter. He is in a cold, damp Roman dungeon, the Mamertine prison, awaiting execution by the sword.
His primary concern is not his own life. His concern is ensuring that Timothy guards the truth and entrusts it to reliable men who can teach others. Augustine saw that this generational chain of education is the mechanism for the faith's survival.
Next is Titus, with the objective to instruct church leaders, advise about groups in the church, and teach Christian ethics. The major doctrine is salvation.
The commentary calls Titus the Magna Charta of Christian liberty.
It earns that title because it so clearly articulates the relationship between grace and ethics, doesn't it?
Yes, it states that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation, and this very same grace trains us to renounce ungodliness. It links the theological reality of grace with the ethical demand for a pure life.
It frees believers from legalism, because salvation is by grace, but it frees them from lawlessness because that grace actively trains them in righteousness.
Exactly. Yes, completely.
Yeah. And finally, Philemon. The objective is highly specific, to effect reconciliation between a runaway slave, Onesimus, and his Christian master, Philemon. The major doctrine is Christian ethics.
Emil Brunner, who died in 1965, called this letter a classic testimony to what is meant by Christian justice.
We have to understand the social economics of the Roman Empire to get the weight of this letter, though. Rome ran on slave labor.
There were millions of slaves. A slave revolt was the empire's greatest terror. If a slave ran away and was caught, the punishment was often crucifixion or being thrown to the beasts.
And Paul is sending the runaway, Onesimus, back to his master. But Paul does not explicitly demand the political dismantling of the Roman institution of slavery in this short text. Instead, he drops a relational bomb into the middle of Philemon's household.
He tells Philemon to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a beloved brother. Yeah. If you truly view someone as your equal brother in Christ, if you are breaking bread with them at the Lord's table and recognizing you are both equally bankrupt sinners, saved entirely by the same grace, the mechanics of exploitation completely fall apart.
You cannot own your brother.
No. Brunner was correct. It is a display of justice rooted entirely in grace. It undermines the institution of slavery from the inside out by changing the ontology of the relationship.
We have walked through this massive blueprint of doctrine. We have seen the tools designed for salvation, for practical church issues, for defending orthodoxy, for anchoring the persecuted, and for structuring the future church.
But now we need to steer the conversation back to the crown jewel of this theology.
Right, we need to return to the central theme of Romans itself. We have seen the breadth of Paul's thought. Now we look at the absolute core.
The crux of the matter.
Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. Righteousness by faith. The text tells us that the theme of Romans is summarized right here, the revelation of a righteousness of God, and the statement, the righteous will live by faith.
The commentary notes that some have suggested this is a summary of Pauline theology as a whole.
But before Paul gets to the glorious mechanics of this salvation, he starts with a very sobering reality.
He addresses the temptation of shame.
The commentary states that the negative phrasing, Paul saying, I am not ashamed, is a sober reflection of the reality that the gospel is something of which Christians will, while still in the world, continually be tempted to be ashamed.
The text references Mark 8.38, Luke 9.26, and 2 Timothy 1.8 to support this.
So what is it about this specific message that generate societal shame or embarrassment for the believer.
Well, think about what the gospel actually claims, especially in the first century Roman context.
Okay.
It tells the most educated philosophers in Athens and the most successful military commanders in Rome that all their achievements count for absolutely nothing when it comes to their standing before God.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, it claims that humanity is so broken, so thoroughly corrupted, that the only solution was for God to become a man and be executed on a Roman cross as a criminal.
And the cross was an obscenity. It was designed to be the most degrading, humiliating death possible.
Right.
There is an ancient Roman graffito found on the Palatine Hill, the Alexamenos graffito. It shows a man worshiping a figure on a cross that has the head of a donkey. The caption reads, "Alexamenos worships his God."
It was meant to mock a Christian soldier. To the Roman mind, worshiping a crucified criminal was absurd.
It was inherently humiliating to human pride. The message of the cross was offensive to Jewish listeners who expected a conquering political king, and it was sheer foolishness to Greek philosophers who valued intellectual elevation and viewed the physical body as something to escape.
To align yourself with a crucified Savior invited mockery, marginalization, and often violence. The temptation to quietly hide that belief or to soften the edges of the message to make it more palatable to high society is an ever-present reality.
So how does Paul counter this overwhelming temptation? How does he look at the absolute peak of Roman intellectual and military might and say, "I am not embarrassed of this message"?
Because of what he knows the message contains. The commentary emphasizes, or rather, the commentary highlights, that Paul views the gospel as the almighty force of God directed toward the salvation of men and women.
He does not see it as a nice philosophical suggestion.
No, he sees it as the only effective rescue operation in existence.
For Paul, eternal issues were at stake. The source lays this out clearly. Those whose minds were blinded, who failed to believe and obey the gospel, were perishing.
The text references 2 Corinthians 4.3.
They would fall under the divine wrath, referencing 2 Thessalonians 1.9. The stakes could not possibly be higher.
When you realize a building is on fire, you are not embarrassed to yell at people to get out. You do not worry about looking foolish or disrupting their dinner.
Right. The shame vanishes because the reality of the danger overrides social decorum.
Paul knows that everyone who believes, whether Jew or Gentile, experiences the gospel effectively becoming the very mechanism of salvation. It is not just news about salvation, it is the force that accomplishes it.
Let's break down the exact mechanics of this righteousness as defined in the source. This is where we need to be incredibly precise.
Yes.
The text says, righteousness denotes the right standing God gives to believers. It is not a moral uprightness we generate through our own effort. It is a legal status given to us in the courtroom of God.
That distinction is the hinge of the entire Christian faith. Justification is a legal declaration. God the judge declares the sinner righteous, not because the sinner is inherently good, but because the perfect righteousness of Christ is credited to their account.
The commentary goes further, and this is the vital part. It states, believers are righteous, justified through faith and by faith, but never on account of faith.
That phrasing is remarkably careful.
It requires us to focus intensely on an analogy this source provides. It says, faith is not itself our righteousness, rather it is the outstretched empty hand that receives righteousness by receiving Christ.
The empty hand analogy. It is brilliant because it clarifies the exact function of faith.
Let's unpack this empty hand analogy because it completely destroys the idea of human merit. If you think about an empty hand reaching out to receive a gift, what is the hand actually doing?
Receiving.
Yeah, if my hand is empty, it brings no currency, it brings no trade value to the transaction. If I hand you $1 million to pay off your mortgage and you reach out to take the check, you do not get to turn around and say, look at how well I received that money.
Right. You don't say, my reaching was so excellent, the angle of my arm was so perfect that I actually earned the $1 million.
The reaching itself possesses zero intrinsic value.
The value is entirely in the object being received. The hand gets no credit.
The empty hand only receives. The commentary makes it explicitly clear. Paul's concept of righteousness or justification is a complete and total work of God, and we can do nothing to earn it.
This is why the text insists we are saved through faith, but not on account of faith.
Wait, unpack that a little more.
Well, if we were saved on account of our faith, then faith becomes a work. Faith becomes the new currency. We would be standing before God saying, God, I admit I did not have perfect moral behavior. I broke your laws, but I did have this really high quality, intense faith, so You owe me salvation based on the merit of my believing.
Which just smuggles human pride right back into the equation through the back door.
Yeah.
It turns faith into a substitute for the law.
Yeah.
You are still trying to buy your way in.
That completely subverts grace. Paul absolutely rejects that. The empty hand analogy clarifies that faith is just the instrument, the conduit.
Yeah.
The hand is completely impoverished. It holds nothing to offer God. It simply receives the righteousness of Christ. The credit goes entirely to the giver, never to the receiver.
That is a staggering reality.
Yeah.
It is a complete and total work of God from start to finish. But this brings up a massive question.
What's that?
If salvation is entirely a work of God requiring empty hands, why are those hands so desperate in the first place? Why do we need to be rescued by an alien righteousness?
Which leads directly to the human condition. Paul knows he cannot fully explain the glory of the cure until he has thoroughly, ruthlessly diagnosed the disease.
We move into the final section of our outline, the downward path, looking at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 32.
The commentary states that before Paul sets forth his message of righteousness by faith, which he expands upon in chapters 3 through 8, he first shows the desperate need for it.
The diagnosis is incredibly bleak. The human race stands condemned, helpless, and hopeless apart from God.
It is a devastating assessment. He's not saying humanity is a little bit sick and needs some moral medicine or behavioral coaching. He is saying humanity is entirely destitute, spiritually dead, and actively rebelling against its creator.
Now, a common objection here is fairness. People might say, how can God condemn people who perhaps did not have a Bible, who lived in a remote area, or who never heard this specific historical message about Jesus?
Right. The source addresses this directly. It asserts that God provided sufficient revelation of his existence and power in the world through creation.
This is the theological concept of natural revelation, right?
Yeah. Paul argues that the physical universe itself is a continuous, undeniable broadcast of God's existence and eternal might.
Oh, wow.
The complexity of the human eye, the order of the solar system, the sheer scale of the cosmos, these are not silent realities. They're constantly testifying to a designer.
The causal link described in the text here is crucial. Because this revelation in creation was sufficient, humanity's failure to acknowledge God is not a passive ignorance.
They are not innocent victims lacking information. It is an active suppression. The text says men and women had nevertheless become idolatrous and polytheistic.
They look at the evidence of the Creator and they push it down. They actively suppress the truth.
It is like trying to hold a fully inflated beach ball underwater. It requires constant, active, exhausting effort to deny what is plainly visible and naturally wants to rise to the surface.
And because humanity rejects the true Creator, they inevitably replace him. You cannot just have a worship vacuum in the human heart. If you remove the true God, you will worship something else.
Hence idolatry and polytheism. They worship the creation rather than the Creator.
And this rejection triggers a terrifying consequence. The commentary details the moral degradation that follows. It says Paul claimed that God gave them up to their dishonorable lusts, passions, conduct, and all kinds of evil.
Yeah.
I want to examine the wording carefully. It is very common to view divine wrath as an active striking down. We picture lightning bolts from the sky. We picture immediate, fiery, catastrophic judgment. But the text describes wrath as God giving them up to their own desires. How is the removal of divine restraint the ultimate form of condemnation?
That is perhaps the most chilling concept in the entire letter. We often think of God's moral laws as restrictive barriers keeping us from having fun, but Paul reveals that those barriers are actually protective grace. When humanity continually beats against those barriers, demanding to be let go, demanding autonomy from God's design, the wrath of God is simply him saying, have it your way.
Wow.
He removes the restraint. He gives them over to the very things they demand.
It makes me think of the psychology of addiction. If someone is deeply addicted to a destructive substance, the worst possible thing you can do for them is to give them unlimited access to it.
The most severe punishment isn't locking them in a room. The most severe punishment is handing them the keys to the pharmacy and walking away.
Letting the addiction run its natural devastating course is a far more terrifying judgment than an immediate physical blow.
That is a highly accurate parallel. God's passive wrath, his handing humanity over to their own corrupted desires, accelerates the destruction. They become slaves to the passions they thought would bring them liberation.
The source outlines the final resulting downward path from this removal of restraint. It is a threefold descent: worthless thinking, moral insensitivity, and religious stupidity.
Let's analyze these stages. Worthless thinking. The mind becomes darkened. It loses its ability to accurately perceive reality because it has rejected the foundation of reality.
Once you deny the Creator, your framework for understanding the universe fractures. You lose the objective standard for truth. You start calling good evil and evil good.
Your philosophy becomes futile because it is disconnected from the source of all logic and order.
Which leads directly to moral insensitivity. The conscience gets seared. The things that used to cause shame now cause pride. The text mentions dishonorable conduct and all kinds of evil. The societal brakes are completely gone.
And then, the final stage, specified in the commentary, religious stupidity.
That is a stark, almost offensive phrase.
It really is.
How does religious stupidity manifest when the mind is completely detached from acknowledging its creator?
It manifests when humans, having access to the staggering brilliance of the cosmos, turn around and bow down to a statue they carved out of a piece of wood. They worship birds and four-footed animals, as Paul notes. Or if you want to look at it in a modern context, it manifests when we attribute the astonishing intricacies of human consciousness, DNA, and biological engineering to blind, undirected chance.
It is the height of irrationality.
When the human mind severs itself from the source of all wisdom, it inevitably embraces absurdity, all while patting itself on the back and calling itself enlightened.
So we have the complete picture. We have seen the utter helplessness of this downward path. Humanity suppresses the truth of natural revelation, embraces worthless thinking, loses all moral sensitivity, and engages in religious absurdity.
The diagnosis is terminal.
But that incredibly dark backdrop is precisely what makes the first part of our discussion so luminous. We see the stark contrast between the total ruin of human effort and the total provision of God's righteousness.
A righteousness that cannot be earned by keeping the law, cannot be bought with moral currency, and cannot be achieved through spiritual striving.
A righteousness grasped only by an empty hand. We have looked at the vast toolkit of Paul's letters, dealing with everything from local church chaos in Corinth to cosmic dualism in Colossae.
We have looked at the massive shifts caused in the lives of men like Luther and Wesley.
But the absolute center of it all remains this truth. The righteous will live by faith.
It is the hinge upon which human destiny turns. It is the core of the biblical message.
If you're listening to this and wondering how this 2,000-year-old theology applies to your modern life, I want to leave you with a final challenge based on the text we have covered today.
Okay.
We established that creation provides sufficient revelation to render all of humanity utterly without excuse. Every person is accountable to the Creator. Yet, we also established that only the gospel possesses the specific almighty force necessary to save a person from that resulting condemnation.
Right.
Think about those two massive realities coexisting. If both are true, that everyone is accountable and only this gospel can save, how should that alter the way you view every single person walking down the street tomorrow? Think about that tension.
It changes everything about how we see the world, how we view our neighbors, and how we understand our own standing before God.
It absolutely does. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking for this deep dive into the mechanics of grace and the letters of Paul. Keep reaching out with empty hands. We will see you next time.